There was a man, see, who woke up every single day believing he knew exactly what he was chasing. He figured life was a long, uphill climb with a finish line marked financial security. And if you didn't reach it, well, you just hadn't climbed hard enough. He wasn't wrong, not entirely, but like so many of us, he spent so much time looking at that finish line. He missed the whole damn landscape he was building with his own two hands as he went. He thought he was just another runner in the race, when all along he was laying the very bricks and mortar of a world far richer than any prize money. Meet Eugene, 48 years old, a factory worker, same as his old man before him, same as a whole lot of men in his neighborhood. You wouldn't notice Eugene in a crowd, not at first glance. He wasn't loud, wasn't flashy. But if you stopped, if you really looked, you'd see it. He looked like a man carved from oak that had weathered 1,000 storms and was ready for 1,000 more. His face was a map of quiet endurance, etched with lines around his eyes that weren't from laughing much, but from squinting into the glare of fluorescent lights and the blinding sun, from scrutinizing fine print on bills, and from observing more than he ever spoke. There was a deep, unshakable honesty in the set of his jaw, a testament to decades of showing up, day in and day out, no matter what. His hands now, those were a story all their own. Calloused, thick-fingered, knuckles swollen in places from years of gripping wrenches, hammers, and the unforgiving steel of machinery. They were the hands of a man who worked, truly worked, who knew the exact weight of a good tool and the biting chill of metal on a winter morning. They were strong, capable hands, always a little grimy beneath the nails no matter how much he scrubbed them clean after a shift. Yet in their raw power there was also a surprising gentleness, a dexterity born from not just brute force, but from countless hours spent carefully assembling, disassembling, and coaxing broken things back to life. His eyes, a faded blue, held a quiet strength, a depth that hinted at more going on behind them than he ever let on. They were often tired, yes, the kind of tired that seeped into your bones after 16 hours on your feet, but they were also observant, missing nothing. He rarely offered an opinion unless asked directly, preferring to listen, to watch, to absorb. He carried himself with a quiet dignity, a humble posture that bespoke years of standing at a conveyor belt, enduring the rhythmic clang and hiss of the factory floor, a dependable cog in a much larger machine. Eugene was, in every sense of the word, a man of honest work, his very presence a testament to persistence and an unwavering, almost stubborn sense of duty. He was the kind of man you'd trust with your last dollar or with your struggling kid, knowing he'd give you his absolute best, without question, without fuss. He was Eugene, and for most of his life he believed that was all he was. They say a man's worth is measured by the sweat on his brow, the strength in his back, or the zeros in his bank account. They say a lot of things. But sometimes the real ledger of a man's life isn't written in ledgers at all, but in the quiet acts, the unseen repairs, the steady presence he offers. It's in the invisible threads he weaves, connecting himself to the world around him, building something far more enduring than any fortune. A man like Eugene. Every morning before the world truly woke, before the first hint of color touched the pre-dawn sky, Eugene's alarm would slice through the quiet of his small house. 5 a.m. Always 5 a.m. The insistent, mechanical chirp was a familiar companion, a harsh but necessary usher into another day. His feet, calloused and accustomed to the cold linoleum, would hit the floor, a quiet thud in the stillness. Coffee, black and strong, brewed while he showered, the steam a momentary escape from the chill that always seemed to cling to the house in the mornings. Towel off, dress in his sturdy work clothes, clean but always a bit faded, a testament to countless washes. No lingering, no dawdling. Time was money even before the clock started ticking at the factory gate. His breakfast was always the same. Oatmeal, sometimes a piece of toast, eaten standing at the kitchen counter. His eyes, though, weren't on the food. They scanned the stack of envelopes, the power bill, the water bill, a notice from the bank about his mother's latest prescription. Always something, always more coming in than going out, it felt like. A quiet anxiety, a low thrum beneath the surface of his morning, a constant reminder of the tightrope he walked. Then the drive, the same worn path to the factory, streetlights still painting long shadows on the cracked pavement. He knew every pothole, every turn, every corner store that was barely holding on, just like him. The world outside his windshield was a blur of familiar gloom, an unchanging tableau that mirrored the unvarying rhythm of his own life. The factory gate, the time clock, the familiar faces, nodding acquaintances, rarely more. The thrum of the machinery, a constant dull roar that vibrated in his chest and stole the quiet from his thoughts. The smell of oil, metal, and sweat, a familiar perfume that clung to his clothes and skin. His station was waiting, the conveyor belt already moving, pulling him into its relentless current. His work was repetitive, mindless in a way that required just enough attention to prevent an accident but left his mind free to wander, or more often to simply numb. He moved with efficiency, his hands strong and calloused, performing the same motions thousands of times a day, each component identical to the last, each hour identical to the one before. Each day a carbon copy of yesterday. He was a machine himself, a human cog, perfectly fitted to his function. Lunch break was a brown paper bag and a thermos, eaten in a corner, staring at a concrete wall. Few words were exchanged. What was there to say? Everyone was living the same rhythm, trying to squeeze a little more life out of a day that seemed determined to wring them dry. When the shift finally ended, the exhaustion wasn't just physical. It was a weariness that settled deep into his bones, a mental fatigue from the sheer monotony. He'd drive home, the sun now setting, casting long, tired shadows, mirroring his own. Evenings weren't much better. A simple meal, often reheated leftovers. A call to his aging mother checking in. A quick stop at his sister's to fix a loose cabinet door or unstop a drain for his elderly neighbor, little things he did, always for free. He never thought to charge. It just felt wrong, like profiting off someone else's trouble, off their need. He would wave off offers of payment, a dismissive hand gesture, feeling awkward about it, almost guilty. He didn't see the true worth of his craft, only the immediate need he was fulfilling. But it was in those quiet hours before bed, when the house finally settled around him, that the other Eugene would stir. Not the factory Eugene, the quiet, dependable cog, but the Eugene who could look at a broken engine and hear its rhythm, who could see the underlying mechanism, the solution. He had a knack for it, a real gift. Fixing things, not just machines, but homes, sometimes even the broken spirits of his neighbors, by making their world a little less chaotic, a little more stable. He loved the satisfaction of making something work again, of restoring order. This quiet, unacknowledged creative spark, this yearning to make things right, was a hidden current beneath his stoic surface. He wanted to leave something behind, something more than just a perfectly assembled component on a production line. A footprint, a memory, a mark that said, I was here, I mattered. But he didn't know how. He saw his own hands, calloused and capable, as simply tools for survival, for earning a paycheck, not instruments for creation or connection. He'd push the thought down, smother it under the weight of responsibility, under the constant pressure to just survive. A whisper in his mind, sometimes in the dead of night, after a particularly long day, would ask, is this all there is? Is this what you were made for? That quiet dignity he carried, it masked a deep-seated fear of simply fading away, unremembered. A fear that all his hard work, all his honest days, would simply evaporate into the ether, leaving no trace. He yearned for meaning, for a purpose that resonated deeper than the factory whistle. But he prioritized immediate financial survival over long-term fulfillment, too easily dismissing his own worth, struggling to articulate his deeper feelings or value his own time. He believed that showing up, doing his job, paying his bills, that was the true measure of a good man. And yet there was this hollow space inside, a knowing that he was capable of so much more if only he could allow himself to see it, to value it. It was a Saturday, one of those hazy late summer afternoons when the air hung heavy and the world seemed to slow down. Eugene was on his porch swing, watching his nephew, Mikey, maybe 8 years old, wrestling with a bright plastic spaceship on the worn rug of the living room. Mikey was a bundle of nervous energy, all sharp elbows and earnest concentration. Today, that concentration was turning into frustration. The spaceship, a birthday gift from a few months back, had seen better days. One of its delicate plastic wings had snapped clean off, a victim of an imaginary intergalactic battle that had ended with a hard landing on the concrete driveway. Mikey, usually a persistent little guy, was at his wits' end. He kept trying to push the broken piece back into place, his small fingers fumbling, his lower lip trembling with a mixture of anger and despair. He let out a little grunt of defeat, then another, a sound that cut through the lazy afternoon quiet like a dull knife. His face was blotchy, close to tears, the joy of play stolen by a piece of cheap plastic. Eugene watched him from the porch, initially just observing, a quiet observer of life as he often was. He saw the boy's shoulders slump, the small, defeated sigh. It was a familiar sight, that kind of helplessness, that inability to make something whole again. Mikey finally gave up, pushing the spaceship away, a silent accusation against the universe for its unfairness. Eugene pushed himself off the porch swing, the old chains groaning a little. He walked inside, his presence quiet, almost unnoticed until he was right there. He knelt beside Mikey, not saying a word, just reaching out a hand, calloused and strong, for the broken toy. Mikey looked up, his eyes still shimmering with unshed tears, but a flicker of hope already there. He handed the ship over. Eugene turned the little plastic vessel in his hands. It wasn't just a toy, it was a symbol of Mikey's world broken. He saw the clean break, the tiny plastic nub where the wing was meant to attach. He reached into the small toolbox he kept by the back door, a habit always having tools close. A tube of model glue, a tiny clamp. His movements were deliberate, practiced. He cleaned the edges of the break with the tip of his finger, applied a bead of glue, held the pieces together with a steady pressure that only years of working with his hands could provide. He didn't rush. He didn't talk. He just fixed. As the glue began to set, Eugene held the clamp in place, his focus entirely on this small, broken thing. He felt the familiar pull, the quiet satisfaction of mending, of restoring. And then something shifted. It wasn't just fixing a toy. It was the way Mikey's eyes had lit up, the way his shoulders had relaxed, the unspoken trust in his uncle's hands. He thought of old Mrs. Henderson's leaky faucet, the one that had kept her up at night for weeks. He'd fixed it, took no money, just a plate of her famous cookies. He thought of young Billy Miller's rickety bike fence, falling apart, a hazard for his dog. Eugene had spent a Saturday morning rebuilding it, stronger than before. No charge, just a grateful nod from Billy's dad. He remembered countless small kindnesses. A jammed door, a sagging shelf, a squirrel-chewed bird feeder, even just a listening ear for a neighbor burdened with troubles that felt as broken as any machine. All those hours, all that effort. He had always dismissed it, telling himself it was just a hobby, just helping out, certainly nothing he should profit from. He felt guilty at the mere thought of charging a neighbor for something he could easily do. But now, looking at Mikey's hopeful face, he saw something else. He saw the invisible safety net he had woven, thread by thread, with every free repair, every helping hand. He saw a reputation of unwavering reliability, of kindness. His hands, these tools he saw only for a paycheck, were instruments of connection, of care. They weren't just building fences, they were building trust. They weren't just fixing pipes, they were mending anxieties. He wasn't just fixing a toy, he was reinforcing a belief for his nephew that things could be made right again, that there were people who cared enough to make them so. The realization settled over him with the weight of something long unacknowledged, profoundly true. He was building something all right. And it was far more valuable than a few extra dollars. The house fell silent again as evening deepened, the drone of crickets outside the only company. Mikey, his spaceship triumphantly reassembled and launched into new adventures, had long since gone home with his mother. But Eugene lay awake, staring up at the dim ceiling of his bedroom. The clock on his nightstand glowed 3:17 a.m. The thought, the one that had snagged in his mind as he glued the plastic wing, now unspooled itself in the quiet darkness, stark and unforgiving. What have you been doing with your life, Eugene? He'd spent nearly 30 years in that factory, the ceaseless hum of machinery a second heartbeat to his own. He was good at it, dependable, a fixture. He provided. For his mother, for his sister's family, for himself. Every bill paid, every plate full, he had done his duty. But was that enough? The question echoed in the hollow space inside him, the one he'd always tried to ignore. He thought of the missed opportunities, not necessarily for more money, but for more life. He turned down the chance to fix Mrs. Petrov's antique clock, not because he couldn't, but because he'd told himself he didn't have the time to do it for free, and he couldn't bring himself to charge her. The same with Mr. Rodriguez's leaky roof, put off until a younger, less skilled, but more assertive handyman had come along. He had always prioritized the certainty of the paycheck, the immediate need for survival, over the profound, unquantifiable value of what he could offer, what he loved to offer. He saw his hands again in the darkness, the rough knuckles, the faint scars from years of manual labor. He'd seen them as instruments of drudgery, tools for survival. But today, with Mikey's toy, he'd seen them as instruments of connection, of care, of quiet transformation. How many times had he dismissed his own worth, told himself that these skills, this innate ability to mend and build, were just hobbies, not real work, not real value. A bitter taste rose in his mouth. He had been so consumed by chasing financial security that he hadn't seen the true wealth he was already generating, not in his bank account, but in the trust of his neighbors, the gratitude in their eyes, the invisible fabric of community he had been weaving. He had given his time, his skill, his care freely, but had never truly understood its profound, lasting value, not to himself, not to his legacy. He had been poor not in coin but in self-recognition, in valuing the richness of his own spirit. A quiet desperation settled over him. He was 48, half a century lived. Was he going to spend the rest of it just surviving? Just being the dependable cog in the machine, never truly building anything that would last beyond his own paycheck? The thought was a cold knot in his stomach. The fear of being forgotten, of simply fading away, pressed in on him harder than it ever had before. He had always measured himself by what he earned, by what he provided. But what if the real measure was what he gave, what he built, what he connected? What if his legacy wasn't in a savings account, but in the hands he helped, the knowledge he shared, the trust he quietly cultivated? The factory whistle, which had always symbolized order and purpose, now sounded like a siren call to a life he was no longer sure he wanted. The factory whistle, which had always symbolized order and purpose, now sounded like a siren call to a life he was no longer sure he wanted. That evening, the question of his value hung heavy in the air, a silent, uninvited guest at the dinner table. His sister had dropped off her 2 kids while she worked a late shift, and the usual cheerful chaos of little hands and voices filled his small house. But even that couldn't quite dislodge the gnawing thought. He watched his nephew, Tommy, a bright-eyed boy of 7, wrestling with a bright red plastic fire truck. There was a sound of exasperated frustration, then a tiny, heart-wrenching sob. A wheel had snapped clean off, leaving the truck listing sadly to one side, its emergency ladder now mocked by its brokenness. Eugene watched as Tommy tried to force it back, his small fingers fumbling, tears welling in his eyes. It was a simple thing, really, just a plastic axle. But to Tommy, it was the end of the world, the loss of a treasured rescue vehicle. Without thinking, Eugene reached out. "Let me see that, Chief." His voice was low, comforting. He took the truck, turning it over in his calloused hands. The wheel's peg was sheared off, a clean break. He disappeared into his small workshop in the shed, a place cluttered with tools, spare parts, and half-finished projects. Within minutes he returned, a tiny, almost invisible screw now holding the wheel firmly in place, stronger than before. Tommy's face, moments ago a picture of despair, transformed. His eyes lit up, a wide, gap-toothed grin spread across his face, and he hugged the truck as if it were solid gold. "You fixed it, Uncle Eugene. You fixed it," he squealed, and then, without another word, was off, racing the fire truck across the worn rug. Watching him, something shifted inside Eugene. It wasn't just a toy he'd fixed. It was hope. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated joy. And then, like a dam breaking, a flood of other memories washed over him. Mrs. Henderson's leaky faucet, the one that had kept her awake for weeks, fixed with a simple washer. Mr. Petrov's gate, creaking mournfully in the wind, secured with a dab of grease and a tightened screw. The community center's erratic lights, brought back to life after he'd spent hours tracing a frayed wire. All the countless small repairs, the little acts of mending, of making things right. Never a bill, never a charge. Just a thank you, a shared cup of coffee, a grateful smile. He saw his own hands, calloused and strong, not just as tools for the factory floor, but as instruments of connection, of care. He wasn't just fixing things. He was fixing peace of mind, fixing trust, fixing the invisible fabric of his neighborhood, one quiet act at a time. He had built an invisible safety net, a reputation of unwavering reliability and kindness, far more valuable than the meager extra dollars he could have earned. He'd never seen it that way. He'd always dismissed these acts as trivial, as not real work, but the sheer incandescent joy on Tommy's face for a mended toy felt more real, more valuable than any paycheck he'd ever received from the factory. His legacy wasn't in a savings account. It was in the hands he helped, the knowledge he shared, the trust he quietly cultivated. Later that night, long after the house had fallen silent, Eugene lay awake. 3 a.m. That hour when the world feels like it holds its breath and truth bites hardest. He stared at the faint glow of the street lamp filtering through his blinds, painting muted stripes across his ceiling. He saw his life, laid out before him, stark and unvarnished. 48 years. 48 years of getting up before the sun, clocking in, clocking out, chasing the next bill, the next small comfort. He had believed that financial security was the ultimate goal, the only true measure of a man. And in that pursuit, he had willingly, unknowingly sacrificed something profound. He had buried that creative spark, that innate desire to mend and build under layers of duty and practical necessity. He told himself it wasn't profitable, not serious, just a hobby. But it was more than a hobby. It was the purest expression of himself. He had built so much for others, but for himself, what lasting monument? just a collection of bills paid, days endured. The fear of being forgotten, of simply fading away, returned with a vengeance, but this time it was laced with a deeper, more brutal honesty. He had been so busy surviving, he hadn't truly lived. He hadn't valued the richness of his own spirit, the deep, quiet satisfaction that came from using his hands not for profit, but for people. He saw himself clearly for the first time. A man rich in skill and community spirit, but poor in self-worth, always chasing a ghost of security. And the thought of continuing down that path, for another year, another decade, felt like a betrayal of his own soul. The silence in the small house was absolute, save for the rhythmic tick of the old grandfather clock in the hall, counting out moments that felt both fleeting and eternal. "Enough!" he whispered, the sound barely audible even to himself, yet it resonated with the force of a hammer striking iron, rattling the very foundations of his quiet, ordered life. It wasn't an angry shout or a desperate plea wrung from exhaustion. It was the quiet, rock-solid declaration of a man who had finally, unequivocally, seen the end of a long, wrong road. He didn't know what lay beyond that end. There was no map, no compass pointing to a brighter future, just the stark, terrifying certainty that the ground he'd been treading for nearly 5 decades had crumbled beneath his feet. The weight in his chest was immense, a lifetime of responsibilities and unmet expectations pressing down. But underneath it, a tiny, almost imperceptible space had opened up, a breath of air that hadn't been there before, a sliver of hope that felt utterly fragile yet stubbornly present. He wasn't sure what enough truly meant for his life, not yet. Only that this relentless, unrewarding chase for a security that always felt out of reach, a security that demanded he deny the very best of himself, had to stop. The thought of another morning, another year, another decade spent blindly pursuing a paycheck at the expense of his hands, his heart, his very essence, felt like a profound betrayal. He'd prioritized immediate financial survival for so long, he'd forgotten that there was more to a man than his balance sheet. He dismissed his own worth, the unique value of his skills, because they hadn't come with a price tag. And in that quiet, pre-dawn dark, he promised himself, his calloused hands and the forgotten creative spark within him, that he would not betray himself again. The exact path forward was obscured, but the direction was clear. Away from the hollow pursuit of profit, towards something truer. The alarm clock, a brutal siren at 4:45 a.m., still wrenched him from sleep the next morning. Habit, thick as concrete, pulled him towards the familiar grind. He went through the motions, coffee brewing, toast popping, the factory uniform pulled on. But something felt different. The air tasted sharper, the hum of the old refrigerator a little louder, the faint scent of toast suddenly vivid. A subtle hitch in his usual autopilot, a tremor in the expected rhythm of his day. As he walked out the door, the chill of the morning air seemed to carry a question, or perhaps an invitation. His breath misted. He climbed into the worn seat of his old Ford pickup, the engine turning over with its usual tired cough before settling into a rumble. He drove, as he did every morning, past the familiar houses of his neighborhood, each porch light a small beacon in the pre-dawn gloom. And then there it was, Mrs. Henderson's house. His gaze snagged, not for the first time, on the loose picket on her front fence, leaning precariously. He'd noticed it a week ago, maybe 2. Usually his internal monologue would kick in. Someone ought to fix that, he'd think, then immediately dismiss it. He'd calculate the lost time, the minuscule profit if he dared to charge her, the hassle of explaining why he, a factory man, was suddenly a handyman. The guilt of profiting from a neighbor's need, mixed with the practicality of needing to get to work. But today something else surfaced, quiet yet insistent. He pictured Mrs. Henderson, frail and alone, struggling with her grocery bags, her hand brushing that rickety fence for support. He pictured her granddaughter, a wisp of a thing, who sometimes waited by the gate for the school bus. And he pictured his own nephew, just yesterday, the broken toy, the profound realization that had hit him like a physical blow. The fence wasn't just a loose piece of wood. It was a small breach in the quiet safety net of their little street. He hesitated, his foot hovering over the accelerator, the engine idling softly, a low growl in the stillness. The factory whistle would blow soon, a shrill reminder of his duty, his obligation. Every minute lost was a minute less on the clock, less pay. The old fear, cold and insidious, tried to worm its way back in, whispering its familiar anxieties. "You need the money, Eugene. Don't be foolish. Don't put yourself out for free. You have bills. You have a life to support." The thought was a well-worn groove, a path his mind had trodden countless times. But this morning it felt different, a dead end. He killed the engine. The silence in the car was sudden, jarring. The factory whistle shrilled in the distance, a long, mournful wail that usually spurred him into action. Today, it felt like a faraway sound, something that no longer held quite the same power over him. He grabbed the old toolbox from the passenger seat, the one he usually kept tucked away in the garage, only to be brought out for family emergencies or his own infrequent projects. It felt heavy, a comforting weight. He walked across the dew-kissed lawn, the cool dampness soaking through his work boots. Mrs. Henderson's house was quiet. He found the loose picket, its nails rusted and bent. It took him only 10 minutes, maybe 15, to hammer it back into place, reinforce it with a couple of stronger screws he always carried, just in case. His hands moved with an almost unconscious efficiency, muscle memory honed over decades of quiet repair. When he stood back, the fence looked solid, upright. A small thing, easily missed, but the street felt a fraction safer. He wiped his hands on his overalls, the faint smell of damp wood and rust clinging to them. He was late. He'd punch in late, explain nothing, just take the hit on his paycheck. The thought, usually a source of gnawing anxiety, was now a dull throb, overshadowed by a quiet, unfamiliar satisfaction. That evening, after the grind of the factory floor, the clanging machines, the repetitive movements, Eugene felt the old weariness settle deep in his bones. He stopped at the grocery store, picking up a few things for his mother. As he waited in line, an old man in front of him, Mr. Petrov, was struggling with a jammed wheel on his shopping cart. Groceries were threatening to tumble. Eugene, without thinking, reached out. "Let me get that, Mr. Petrov." A quick, decisive tug, a twist of the wheel, and it spun freely. Mr. Petrov looked up, surprised, then a slow, grateful smile spread across his wrinkled face. "Eugene, my boy, you always know how to fix things, don't you? Thank you." Eugene just nodded, a small, almost imperceptible lift at the corner of his lips. He hadn't charged, hadn't thought about charging. It was just what he did. But this time, the internal voice that usually chastised him for not monetizing his skill was silent, replaced by a faint warmth. The next few days were a quiet battle waged within himself. The factory floor called him, demanding his focus, his time, his sweat. And every morning, the subtle pull of his community made itself known. A neighbor's porch light flickered erratically. A loose shutter on the old church. A broken hinge on his sister's back gate. Each time, the old anxieties clawed at him. "You're not a charity, Eugene. You're already stretched thin. You have your own responsibilities." He'd find himself calculating, almost automatically, the hours, the cost of materials, the opportunity cost of not taking on an extra shift at the plant. One afternoon, a letter arrived, an unexpected increase in his mother's prescription copay. The numbers on the bill seemed to mock his new resolve. Stared at it, the paper trembling slightly in his calloused hand. A wave of familiar dread washed over him, chilling him to the bone. "This is why you chase the money, Eugene. This is why you put your head down and work." He almost called the factory to ask about overtime, the easy, familiar comfort of more hours, more pay, tempting him like a siren song. He imagined the exhaustion, the extra strain, the dull ache in his shoulders, but also the momentary relief of a slightly fatter paycheck. He walked out to his small back garden, pulling at weeds with a vicious intensity, his mind churning. He could hear his nephew, Leo, laughing with his sister in the house next door. He remembered the look on Leo's face when his toy had broken, the despair. And then the simple, profound joy when Eugene had fixed it. He remembered Mrs. Henderson's solid fence, Mr. Petrov's grateful smile. He wasn't earning money from these things, but what was he earning? The battle raged in the quiet hours. He'd wake at 3 a.m., staring at the ceiling, the figures of his bank balance and his bills dancing like malevolent spirits in the darkness. He'd replay conversations, imagining arguments with himself. "You're a fool, Eugene. A soft touch. They'll take advantage." He'd feel the old guilt creep in, not for charging, but for even thinking about charging. The paradox was a knot in his gut. There were moments he faltered. He saw Mr. Davies struggling to start his old lawnmower, heard the sputtering cough from 2 houses down. His first instinct was to walk by, keep his head down. "Not my problem, Eugene. You've got your own lawn, your own troubles." He made it halfway down his driveway before stopping. He pictured Mr. Davies, his own father's age, frail, alone. He imagined the struggle, the frustration. He let out a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of years. He turned around, walked to his garage, and pulled out his own tools. It took him a good hour, a carb rebuild, a spark plug change. Mr. Davies pressed a $20 bill into his hand, his eyes shining with gratitude. Eugene hesitated, then pushed it back. "Just glad to help, Mr. Davies. Keep it for something nice for yourself." The old man's face crumpled with emotion. Eugene felt a surge of something akin to warmth in his chest. A strange sort of victory. It wasn't about the money, it was about the choice. He kept pushing through. He spent Saturday morning at the community center, patching a leaky roof that had been bothering them for months. He declined the offer of a small payment from the grateful committee. His hands, usually tired by the weekend, felt energized by the unfamiliar purpose. He was still getting up at 5 a.m., still punching in at the factory, but the minutes before and after work, his lunch breaks, his Saturdays, they were slowly being reclaimed, not for profit, but for connection. The old fear of being forgotten, of leaving no mark, was beginning to recede, replaced by the quiet hum of usefulness, of belonging. His calloused fingers, once only instruments of his paid labor, were now conduits of care, weaving a new kind of fabric into the life of his street, his small corner of the world. He was building something, not with wood and nails alone, but with trust and quiet kindness, brick by unseen brick. The harvest, he was beginning to understand, wasn't something you tallied in a ledger. The weeks bled into each other. Each day at the factory, a familiar, relentless thrum beneath a new, subtler melody that had begun to play in Eugene's life. He still rose with the pre-dawn dark. The clatter and hum of the assembly line still grated on his ears for 8 long hours, and the ache in his back was still a constant companion by quitting time. But something had fundamentally shifted. The grind hadn't vanished, but its sharp, insistent edges seemed to have dulled, softened by the quiet anticipation of what he might do after. His lunch break wasn't just a race against the clock to eat a cold sandwich anymore. It was a chance to quickly tighten a loose hinge on Mrs. Henderson's shed door, or offer a word of advice to young Mr. Kim about his sputtering lawnmower. He started looking forward to these small, unpaid tasks, the favors, the odd jobs that offered no financial return, but seemed to feed something deep inside him that had long been starving for purpose beyond the pay stub. The weeks bled into each other. Each day at the factory, a familiar, relentless thrum beneath a new, subtler melody that had begun to play in Eugene's life. He still rose with the pre-dawn dark. The clatter and hum of the assembly line still grated on his ears for 8 long hours, and the ache in his back was still a constant companion by quitting time. But something had fundamentally shifted. The grind hadn't vanished, but its sharp, insistent edges seemed to have dulled, softened by the quiet anticipation of what he might do after. His lunch break wasn't just a race against the clock to eat a cold sandwich anymore. It was a chance to quickly tighten a loose hinge on Mrs. Henderson's shed door, or offer a word of advice to young Mr. Kim about his sputtering lawnmower. He started looking forward to these small, unpaid tasks, the favors, the odd jobs that offered no financial return, but seemed to feed something deep inside him that had long been starving for purpose beyond the pay stub. Eugene found himself smiling more, not a wide, boisterous grin, but a slow, gentle curve that reached his tired eyes, easing the lines around them. It was a private thing, a warmth that settled deep in his chest. Mrs. Henderson, after he'd patched up a tricky leak under her kitchen sink, no charge, of course, just a few minutes after he clocked out from the factory, pressed a still-warm apple pie into his hands, the scent of cinnamon and baked apples a-balm. "Eugene," she'd said, her voice soft with an age-old wisdom. "You're a godsend. Don't you ever forget that." Young Mr. Kim, who'd been struggling with a sputtering lawnmower engine, started dropping by to ask about minor car troubles, sometimes just to share stories of his own family, his challenges, his small triumphs. It wasn't just about the mechanics anymore. People saw Eugene differently. They saw the man who didn't just mend their possessions, but seemed to mend a little piece of their day, their worry, with a quiet competence that spoke volumes. The knot of loneliness that had tightened around Eugene's heart for years began to loosen, unraveling thread by invisible thread. He wasn't just a cog in the factory, not just a quiet man living alone in his small house. He was a presence, a steady hand, a reassuring voice in a world that often felt chaotic and uncaring. The community, once a backdrop to his solitary existence, now felt like a living, breathing tapestry he was helping to weave, thread by careful, patient thread. Hope, a fragile thing he hadn't dared to acknowledge, started to sprout in the small, sunlit patches of his day, pushing through the concrete of his long-held resignation. He started to walk a little straighter, to meet eyes a little longer, to feel the quiet thrum of belonging. One crisp Saturday morning, the kind where the air smelled of wood smoke and damp earth, his young nephew, Mikey, arrived at his porch, shoulders slumped, clutching the remains of a remote control car. The plastic casing was cracked, wires hung loose like tangled spaghetti, and Mikey's eyes were downcast, mirroring the toy's brokenness. Instead of just taking it and fixing it in his usual efficient silence, Eugene knelt beside him on the weathered porch swing. "All right, Mikey," he said, his voice soft but firm, a tone usually reserved for coaxing life back into stubborn engines. "Let's see what we got here." He didn't just fix it for him. He guided Mikey's small, fumbling fingers, explaining the tiny wires, the purpose of each gear, the simple logic of cause and effect. He held the little screwdriver steady, letting Mikey make the turn, celebrating the small victories. He watched as understanding, bright and sudden, dawned on the boy's face, as the little car whirred back to life under their combined effort, zipping across the worn porch floor. That day, something profound clicked into place for Eugene. He wasn't just repairing objects. He was repairing connections, building confidence, passing on wisdom that went far beyond screwdrivers and wrenches. His own hands, still calloused and strong from the relentless demands of the factory floor, now felt infused with a different kind of power, the power to teach, to nurture, to empower. His small house, once just a roof over his head, felt less like a retreat from the world and more like a hub, a quiet beacon where people knew they could find help, a kind word, and a steady, dependable strength. He'd found his true place not by earning more but by giving more, by sharing the gifts he'd always considered mere hobbies. He was no longer running uphill, chasing a phantom finish line of financial security. He was standing firm, a quiet pillar, watching the landscape of his life transform not into a field of gold but a thriving garden of trust and gratitude, richer than any fortune he could ever have imagined. The fear of being forgotten had vanished, replaced by the quiet certainty that his mark, however subtle, was etched deeply into the lives he touched. He would sit on his porch swing in the evenings, the rhythm of the old wood creaking a familiar counterpoint to the distant hum of traffic and the chirping of crickets. Watching the streetlights flicker on, painting the familiar street in hues of orange, he'd sometimes murmur to himself, the words tasting like old, bitter tea finally sweetened. "Used to think money was the only way to measure a man," he'd say, the memory of that relentless pursuit a faint echo. "Chasing it always felt like I was running uphill, never quite catching my breath, always feeling a little less, a little wanting. But then I saw all the little things I did for folks, things I never charged for, how much they mattered. Not to a ledger, not to a bank account, but to the very